Flexibility is a very substantial issue. It comes back to a fundamental issue of the risk of back pain in shearers. That risk of back pain is probably one of the biggest injury risks that shearers face. Now, when we bend forward, and we bend forward to shear a sheep, or we bend forward to do any functional activity, but when we bend forward to shear, bending forward is a combination of bending at the low back and bending at the hips. There are people, myself included, who cannot touch their toes. I just cannot do it. That's because my occupation doesn't demand it of me. There are people, when they bend forward, their hips become so limited by their hamstrings and other tissues that the only way they can flex forward further is by flexing their low back. So these people have considerable tightness around the hip joints and the hamstrings. And in order, therefore, for those people, if they were to take on a shearing occupation, in order for those people to be able to undertake some of the blows under full flexion when they're working, the only way they can achieve it is to put full physical loading, full physical demand in the low back. Now, you have this ratio of balance of movement between the hip and the low back. If more of the movement is capable of being done at the hip, that reduces the amount of movement demand on the low back. The question, of course, is, so what? The point is, the hip joint, it's a ball and socket joint, it's powerful, big, strong, solid bones. We've got two of them. We've got butt muscles, we've got hamstrings, we've got quadriceps and hip flexors muscles. They're very, very powerful muscles, very strong joints, and they can handle the demands of load day in, day out. They're tremendously stronger and more capable of handling load and movement than the lumbar spine. The lumbar spine is a series of vertebrae linked with muscles and linked with ligaments that have nowhere near the strength of the hip. So if you have to bend forward, which is a combination of the hip and the lumbar spine, these structures here, the hip, the butt muscles, the thigh muscles, the more flexibility and the more strength, particularly flexibility, that you have when you're working in this situation, the less extremes of load and extremes of movement you put on your low back. So the point is, greater flexibility and greater mobility around the hip joint for shearers is a highly desirous thing to have. It should reduce the amount of load and the amount of strain occurring in the low back by increasing flexibility. Less demand is placed on the low back compared to the hip. Not only for shearers, but the other guys are very important people to work in the shed. The wool handlers have stooped and bent postures, picking up fleeces, bending a lot of time as well. This flexibility issue around the hip lumbar spine is also important. Shearing is one of the toughest occupations there is. The workload, the energy requirements, the physical demands on the spine, some of the research that we've done, the results, some of the research that's been done in Australia, some of the collaborative research we're doing with guys in Canada. Everyone's amazed at the workload, the work ethic, the forces, the demands of shearing. It's a highly physically demanding job where considerable loads are placed on the body. For a young person wishing to get into it, there are certain issues that should really be considered by those people wishing to get into it, and should also be considered by the people who will now be in the position of training some of these young people. One of the predominant issues that needs to be considered, it's very physically demanding. Both upper body and lower body strength is terribly important. Fitness levels before arriving in the shearing profession are absolutely essential, a high level of fitness to get into the workforce. And this is becoming an issue where we're now seeing increased problems with sedentary lifestyle and young people not as active and physically active in recreational activities as has been in the past. One of the big factors, and this is coming through from our research as well, is that shearers need a tremendous amount of flexibility, as I've already alluded to. Now, a lot of young guys coming into it, it tends to be young men who come into the shearing profession, they need flexibility. We've seen Shannon and Dwayne talk about the need to control sheep between the legs and highly choreographed and highly skilled body positions and highly skilled manoeuvring of sheep in order to be able to put in the right blows and remove the wool most appropriately. If these young people cannot reach and cannot get initial levels of flexibility in order to be able to put the animal control and the appropriate shearing blows in, then trouble's going to occur. They haven't got the hip flexibility, they will end up putting significant and substantial strains on their spine, and they'll have to try and adapt their own postures and their movements at divergence from what is asked of them for their tasks. So a young person who cannot, in a shearing course, cannot get initial levels of flexibility, let's say close to the feet, they might need to consider advice and means of attending either a gym or undertake instruction with some form of physical instructor in order to develop both flexibility as well as achieve high levels of strength and fitness.